Listen to a conversation between a student and an admissions officer at City College.
Hi, can I ask you a few questions about starting classes during your summer session?
Sure, ask away. It starts next week, you know.
Yeah, and I want to get some required courses out of the way so maybe I can graduate one term earlier and get out into the job market sooner.
That sounds like a good idea. Let me pull up the summer school database on my computer here.
Okay.
Okay. There it is. What's your student ID number?
Oh, well, the thing is, I'm not actually admitted here. I'll be starting school upstate at Hooper University in the fall, but I'm down here for the summer staying with my grandparents 'cause I have a summer job near here.
Oh, I see. Well...
So I'm out of luck?
Well, you would be if you were starting anywhere but Hooper. But City College has a sort of special relationship with Hooper, a full exchange agreement. So our students can take classes at Hooper and vice versa. So if you can show me proof, your admissions letter from Hooper, then I can get you into our system here and give you an ID number.
Oh, cool. So, I want to take a math course and a science course, preferably biology. And I was also hoping to get my English composition course out of the way, too.
Oh, well, all three of those courses are offered in the summer, but you've got to understand that summer courses are condensed. You meet longer hours and all the assignments are doubled up because it's the same amount of information presented and tested as in a regular term, but it's only 6 weeks long. 2 courses are considered full-time in summer term. Even if you weren't working, I couldn't let you register for more than that.
Yeah, I was half expecting that. What about the schedule? Are classes only offered during the day?
Well, during the week, we have some classes in the daytime and some at night. And on the weekends, we have some classes all day Saturday or all day Sunday for the 6 weeks.
My job's pretty flexible, so one on a weekday and one on a weekend shouldn't be any problem. Okay, so after I bring you my admissions letter, how do I sign up for the classes?
Well, as soon as your student ID number is assigned and your information is in our admission system, you can register by phone almost immediately.
What about financial aid? Is it possible to get it for the summer?
Sorry, but that's something you would have had to work out long before now. But the good news is that the tuition for our courses is about half of what you're going to be paying at Hooper.
Oh, well that helps. Thank you so much for answering all my questions. I'll be back tomorrow with my letter.
I won't be here then, but do you see that lady sitting at that desk over there? That's Ms. Brinker. I'll leave her a note about what we discussed, and she'll get you started.
Cool.
Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the question.
So I'm out of luck?
Well, you would be if you were starting anywhere but Hooper.
What does the woman mean when she says this?
Well, you would be if you were starting anywhere but Hooper.
Listen to part of a lecture in a world history class.
In any introductory course, I think it's always a good idea to step back and ask ourselves, what are we studying in this class, and why are we studying it? So, for example, when you looked at the title of this course in the catalog, Introduction to World History, what did you think you were getting into? What made you sign up for it? Besides filling the social science requirement. Anyone?
Well, just the history of everything, like starting at the beginning with, I guess, the Greeks and Romans, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, that kind of stuff. Like what we did in high school.
Okay. Now what you're describing is one approach to world history. In fact, there are several approaches. Basic models or conceptual frameworks of what we study when we do history. And what you studied in high school, what I call the Western Heritage Model, this used to be the most common approach in U.S. high schools and colleges. In fact, it's the model I learned with when I was growing up back, about 100 years ago. At Middletown High School up in Maine. I guess it made sense to my teachers back then, since, the history of Western Europe was the cultural heritage of everyone in my class. And this remained the dominant approach in most U.S. schools till, maybe 30, 40 years ago. But it doesn't take more than a quick look around campus, even just this classroom today, to see that the student body in the U.S. is much more diverse than my little class in Middletown High. And this Western heritage model was eventually replaced by, or sometimes combined with, one or more of the newer approaches. And I want to take a minute to describe these to you today, so you can see where this course fits in. Okay, so up until the mid-20th century, the basic purpose of most world history courses was to learn about a set of values, institutions, ideas, which were considered the heritage of the people of Europe. Things like democracy, legal systems, types of social organization, artistic achievements. Now, as I said, this model gives us a rather limited view of history. So in the 1960s and 70s, it was combined with or replaced by what I call the different cultures model. The 60s were a period in which people were demanding more relevance in the curriculum, and there was criticism of the European focus that you were likely to find in all the academic disciplines. For the most part, the different cultures model didn't challenge the basic assumptions of the Western heritage model. What it did was insist on representing other civilizations and cultural categories, in addition to those of Western Europe. In other words, the heritage of all people, not just what goes back to the Greeks and Romans, but also the origins of African, Asian, Native American civilizations. Though more inclusive, it's still basically a heritage model, which brings us to a third approach, what I call the patterns of change model. Like the different cultures model, this model presents a wide cultural perspective. But with this model, we're no longer limited by notions of fixed cultural or geographical boundaries. So then, studying world history is not so much a question of how a particular nation or ethnic group developed, but rather it's a look at common themes, conflicts, trends that cut across modern-day borders of nations or ethnic groups. In my opinion, this is the best way of studying history, to better understand current-day trends and conflicts. For example, let's take the study of the Islamic world. Well, when I first learned about Islamic civilization, it was from the perspective of Europeans. Now, with the patterns of change model, we're looking at the past through a wider lens. So we would be more interested, say, in how interactions with Islamic civilization, the religion, art, literature, affected cultures in Africa, India, Spain, and so on. Or let's take another example. Instead of looking at each cultural group as having a separate, linear development from some ancient origin, in this course, we'll be looking for the common themes that go beyond cultural or regional distinctions. So, instead of studying a particular succession of British kings or a dynasty of Chinese emperors, in this course, we'll be looking at the broader concepts of monarchy, imperialism, and political transformation.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
So, for example, when you looked at the title of this course in the catalog, Introduction to World History, what did you think you were getting into? What made you sign up for it? Besides filling the social science requirement.
What is the professor's attitude? Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class.
Okay, now let's talk about another environmental concern, soil erosion. It's a major problem all around the world. Sometimes erosion damages soil so severely that the land can no longer be cultivated, and it's just abandoned. That happened in a big way right here in the United States. Some of you have probably read the novel The Grapes of Wrath, and maybe you remember that the story took place in the 1930s during the time of what was called the Dust Bowl. Dust Bowl is a term we use to describe an ecological and human disaster that took place in the southern Great Plains region. For nearly 8 years, dust and sand blew across the area and covered everything. It was so bad, it even made breathing and eating difficult. and farmers could only look on helplessly as their crops were destroyed, and the land and their lives ruined. Now, there had always been droughts and strong winds in that region, but that was okay because the native grasses had deep roots in the ground that were able to hold the soil in place. So the wind wasn't able to, erode the soil too badly. This changed, though, between 1900 and 1930. Agriculture was expanding rapidly then, and lots of farmers in the southern Great Plains wanted to grow wheat and other crops they could sell for cash, crops that would be profitable. So they ripped up much of the grassland to plant these crops like wheat, which don't hold the soil down nearly as well. At the same time, livestock, cattle, too many of them, were feeding on grasses in the area and damaging a lot of the grassland. So these animals caused even more erosion of the soil. It didn't help that many of the actual owners of the land were not living anywhere near the area. A lot of the landowners lived way back east and rented out the land to local people who lived on the land and worked on it, but didn't have much reason to take really good care of it. I mean, it wasn't their land, right? The tenant farmers weren't really interested in conserving someone else's soil. Not for the long term, anyway. Also, some thought the land couldn't really be damaged. That the soil was so rich and deep that it didn't matter if the topsoil, the soil on the surface, blew away. They thought they could just plow up more. But they were wrong. Good topsoil takes a long time to form. It can literally take thousands of years to create good topsoil that will grow vegetation, and a very short time to ruin it. So after only a few years of excessive plowing, the land pretty much couldn't be farmed anymore, and people moved on to other places and let the old areas just sit there. And when they didn't plant anything on that land, that made it vulnerable to even more erosion. So it was kind of a vicious cycle, you could say. Another problem, ironically, was that advances in technology were actually destroying the land instead of improving it. A lot of farmers were using huge new tractors that dug deep into the ground and tore up a lot of the soil. And then, of course, there was the weather. When people look back on the Dust Bowl era, they tend to blame the drought, the lack of rain between 1934 and 1937. We can't ignore the drought. I mean, it was the worst on record at the time and did help bring on this disaster. But without the soil destruction, the drought alone wouldn't have resulted in the devastation we call the Dust Bowl. It was poor farming techniques that made that happen. Since then, though, we've paid more attention to trying to prevent a future Dust Bowl. One thing Congress did was enact a massive government effort to improve soil conservation called the Soil Erosion Act. Under this law, large stretches of land in the southern Great Plains were identified as being at risk for erosion and were taken out of production and turned into permanent grassland. What that did, by protecting the land from excessive farming, was to stabilize the soil. Also, the Soil Erosion Act helped educate farmers to practice better soil conservation techniques, like reducing how often they plowed and using better equipment that would, minimize damage to the soil structure.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
A lot of the landowners lived way back east and rented out the land to local people who lived on the land and worked on it, but didn't have much reason to take really good care of it. I mean, it wasn't their land, right?
Why does the professor say this?
I mean, it wasn't their land, right?